Hello and welcome to Lesson 5 of our introductory course to the SweetCloud Development Framework, the shortcomings of SDF. My name is Eric and I am still your instructor for this course. So far in our lessons, we have discussed the positives of SDF, what it is, how it works, why you should consider using it. Now it's time to take a look at the negatives. We look at what SDF is not intended to do and where it misses the mark on what it is intended to do. We do that not to beat up on the SDF development team. We do that to gain an understanding of where we are going to need to add our own checks and processes in order to fully trust our deployments. SDF is not a perfect product, but there's no such thing anyway. Our aim with this lesson is to understand some of the limitations and the challenges of working with SDF. We'll start by looking at some of the things SDF is not intended to do. First, SDF is designed with developers in mind. All of its tools and features and processes require some baseline knowledge of software development, environments, and tools. And while people without this baseline knowledge can certainly learn and use SDF, that learning curve is likely to be very steep and probably impractical in most situations. They are likely better served by features like copy to account or suite bundles, or researching third parties and installing those products. Each of those is going to come with its own limitations and trade offs, but it is more likely to get them to their desired result faster. Next, SDF is not designed to be a data import tool. While we saw in our previous lesson that SDF does offer some limited data import capabilities for custom records, CSV imports are going to serve this function far better than SDF ever will. Lastly, SDF is designed to be non-destructive. It doesn't offer any delete operations, and you can't undeploy a project. Removing files, removing objects from your project will not remove them from the account. You have to do that manually yourself. Now, this is probably a sensible default behavior for SDF to have, but there are certainly times where you want to remove customizations. Right now, SDF does not support that at all. Now, on to some of the challenges that you might face while working with SDF. First, troubleshooting any validation or deployment problems can be really troublesome and cumbersome. We've seen a little bit of this earlier in the course when we looked at common errors and resolutions for them. Error messages can be cryptic or vague. The individual commands are black boxes to us. We can't modify them in any way, so we can't introduce our normal troubleshooting tools like a debugger environment or trace logging to pinpoint the error. The validation and dry run processes that we use during troubleshooting can take a long time, especially in a large project, if we're not careful about trimming down the list of objects that we're validating and deploying. But in trimming down the list, we might be masking the old error or introducing new errors. And either way, we're increasing our efforts for troubleshooting. Hopefully, some of the tactics and processes we looked at earlier will help you avoid some of this thrashing. One of the reasons that validation and deployment can take so long is that SDF always deploys every object in the project. With files, SDF will compare a hash of the file contents between the local version and the file cabinet version, and it will only deploy files which have changed. With objects, there is no such comparison. Every object caught by your deploy.xml settings will always be deployed, regardless of whether it has changed. My hope is that this sort of intelligence will be added to object handling in the future, because then perhaps SDF could notify us that the account definition and the local definition have both changed. This lack of conflict detection is perhaps the largest challenge and the most significant shortcoming of SDF, in my opinion. SDF won't tell you if your local changes conflict with account changes. Anytime you run object update to pull down changes, your local changes will be silently overwritten by the account version. Anytime you deploy, any account changes will be overwritten by the definition you have locally. This can be a massive problem, especially in an environment where objects can be changed by multiple people, multiple teams, either through the project or through the UI. I call this problem environmental drift. There are always at least two definitions of any SDF object. There is the local definition in the XML file in your project, and there is the definition that is actually deployed in the account. Let's look at a custom body field as an example. Initially, the two definitions match exactly. Now, you, the developer, open up the XML file and you add a description to the field and help text to the field, and you change the default value. Before you deploy, an administrator logs into the UI and changes the permissions on the file. And now we have this gap in between the definitions. The two definitions have drifted apart. If you now run object update to pull down changes from the account, the changes the administrator made will wipe out the local changes that you have made. If instead you deploy your definition, that will overwrite the administrator's changes. Either way, you lose customizations, and either way, SDF will not tell you. You are left to discover on your own that something is missing. Over on my own blog, I have a detailed discussion about this environmental drift problem and how I've learned to solve it using Git. Unfortunately, SDF has no built-in resolution for this problem. We are left to create our own process, our own rigor, our own checks to detect and prevent this problem from occurring. And it is very important that you do detect and prevent this problem from occurring in order to avoid losing customization changes. Another shortcoming of SDF is actually something I consider a bug, and I hope the SDF team does as well. There are blind spots in both the validation and the dry run operation. Not all situations that can cause a failure during deployment are caught during validation or a dry run. Your customization project can pass validation, pass a dry run, and then still fail to deploy. One example of this is when an inactive role is specified in the permissions of a custom object. Neither the validate or the dry run will detect this as any sort of problem, but when you go to deploy, the deployment will fail due to the role being inactive. And gaps like this in validation steps can lead to both false positives, false successes, and silent failures during your deployments. Either your deployment will fail, potentially leaving your customization in this weird, partially deployed state, or your deployment won't fail, but the object is still misconfigured. You won't know anything is wrong until you discover it in the behavior of your NetSuite account, which is the last place we want to discover problems. Now, all that said, dry runs and validations do catch the vast majority of deployment errors ahead of time. They do their job correctly nearly all the time. However, there are a number of edge cases that either are not or cannot be caught in advance, and it's important to be aware of those. I can't provide you with an exhaustive list of them because it changes as SDF undergoes development. What I can do is recommend that you go to the known issues on the GitHub repository if you do encounter one of these gaps. If there's not already an issue covering your case, make sure you provide some detail and information to help the SDF team investigate. And if there is a relevant issue, go ahead and pile on, add more details to help that investigation further. I have opened a number of issues on the repository in the past, and I've always found the team, the actual SDF developers, to be very responsive. We have just one limitation left to address here. At this time, SDF does not support 100% of the custom objects in NetSuite. And even among the objects it does support, it doesn't always support 100% of the properties and behaviors associated with that object. It is under active development. I do expect in the future SDF will have 100% coverage of NetSuite customizations, but that is just not the case at this time. Although what is and is not supported is documented in NetSuite Help at a high level, it can be a little difficult to determine which facets of which objects are supported right now. As with validation, though, most customizations are fully supported. There are edge cases where you won't have SDF support, and it is important to be aware of that. Also, as with validation, I can't give you an exhaustive list, as that list is constantly changing. But over on the Salto blog, Chidi Okodire has an excellent write-up about some of these gaps, and I highly recommend you give that a read. You will find links to all of the resources that I've mentioned down below the video. In this lesson, we've identified many of the limitations and shortcomings of SDF in order to help us better understand where we will need to inject our own processes, our own vigilance. In the next lesson, we'll bring the course to a close by providing you with some resources to further your learning and your leverage of SDF. As always, be sure to visit the course's Slack channel with any questions or answers that you might have for myself or your fellow students. If you have any connections or colleagues who might also benefit from either this course or the SuiteHub platform, please share that link with them. Thank you once again for being here. I will see you in the last lesson.